The only American city named after a man its residents despised is also the busiest gateway to the most visited national park in the country. Gatlinburg, Tennessee, population 3,577, absorbs somewhere north of 12 million visitors a year. That ratio, roughly 1,500 tourists for every single resident during peak season, makes Gatlinburg one of the most lopsided places in the Western Hemisphere. There are more active Airbnb listings inside city limits than there are homes for people who actually live there. And yet the title of this film is not a joke. Something has gone very wrong in the mountains, and the strange part is that it happened because everything went very right. To understand Gatlinburg, you have to start with the man nobody wanted. In 1854, a North Carolina preacher and serial litigant named Radford C. Gatlin rode into a mountain settlement called White Oak Flats, a scattering of cabins and one general store along the West Fork of the Little Pigeon River, home to maybe 600 people, most of them descendants of the Ogle, McCarter, Whaley, and Trentham families who had been homesteading these hollows since the early 1800s. Gatlin bought 50 acres, opened a second general store, and immediately began suing his neighbors. He tried to claim 5,000 acres of land-grant property that already had settlers living on it. He launched his own breakaway Baptist congregation. The locals called it the Gatlinite Church, and was promptly expelled by his own congregants for being impossible. He was a Democrat in Republican country, a Confederate sympathizer in a pro-Union valley, and a man who picked fights the way other people picked beans, constantly, without much thought to consequence. But in 1856, Gatlin secured something no lawsuit could undo. He got the U.S. government to put a post office inside his general store, and the town's name changed from White Oak Flats to Gatlinburg. When the neighbors finally ran him out, the exact circumstances are disputed, but the word banished appears in most accounts, Gatlin reportedly agreed to leave peacefully on one condition: the name stays. His neighbors, who hated the man but couldn't be bothered to petition Washington for a change, accepted. And so a town that wanted nothing to do with Radford Gatlin has carried his name for nearly 170 years. It's the first irony of many. For the next half-century, nothing much happened. White Oak Flats, Gatlinburg now, remained what it had been, an isolated mountain community where people farmed small plots along creek bottoms, ran hogs into the timber, and lived largely without roads, electricity, or schools. The Civil War barely touched the town. The residents were mostly pro-Union, and only one minor skirmish was fought within the settlement. The Cherokee had called these mountains Shackenage, place of the blue smoke, for the mist that pooled in the valleys every morning. And for decades after the war, that mist still hung over a place the outside world had no reason to find. A school opened in 1867, but operated only 3 months a year. By 1912, Gatlinburg proper had 6 houses, a blacksmith shop, and one general store serving roughly 600 people spread across the surrounding ridges and hollows. No public school, no doctor closer than Sevierville, a bone-jarring ride over unpaved mountain roads. That same year, the Pi Beta Phi Fraternity, a national women's organization devoted to charitable education, arrived and established a settlement school in Gatlinburg. The school taught reading and arithmetic, but its lasting contribution was more complicated. Pi Beta Phi's teachers encouraged Appalachian craft traditions, weaving, wood carving, pottery, quilting, not just as cultural preservation, but as commerce. They helped mountain women market their work to outsiders, creating what became known as a cottage craft industry. Over the following decades, that school would evolve into the Aeromont School of Arts and Crafts, an internationally recognized institution that still operates on a campus near downtown Gatlinburg. The seed of Gatlinburg as a place people came to, rather than a place people lived, was planted right there in a schoolhouse, and it was planted by women from Indiana and Illinois who saw Appalachian poverty and thought the answer was a gift shop. The man who watered that seed was Andrew Huff. Huff had come to Gatlinburg to run sawmills during the logging boom that was stripping the Smokies bare in the early 1900s. Lumber companies like the Little River Lumber Company had built 150 miles of railroad track deep into the mountains, clear-cutting ancient forests at a pace that would ultimately claim 80% of the primeval timber within park boundaries. Within 20 years, the largely self-sufficient economy of the mountain people, barter, subsistence farming, hog running, was almost entirely replaced by dependence on manufactured goods, store-bought food, and cash wages. Boom towns with names like Elkmont, Smokemont, Proctor, and Tremont sprang up overnight along the railroad tracks, their boarding houses full of lumberjacks who felled trees 6 days a week and drank on the 7th. The Little River Lumber Company, shrewder than most, had started attaching observation cars to its timber trains in 1909, offering tourists a scenic ride from Knoxville to Elkmont for $1.95, selling views of the landscape it was clear-cutting as a sightseeing experience. But Andrew Huff was watching something else. More and more hikers, naturalists, and curious families from Knoxville and beyond were beginning to appear in the mountains, attracted by the scenery that the loggers were busy destroying. Huff saw that the trees would run out, but the mountains wouldn't. In 1916, while the saws were still screaming, he built the Mountain View Hotel. It was Gatlinburg's first real accommodation, eventually 100 rooms, grand by local standards, standing at what is now the center of town. The Mountain View was not a rough lodge for lumberjacks. It had private baths by the 1940s, carpeting and telephones by the 1950s. Eleanor Roosevelt stayed there. So did the cast of Gunsmoke. It was the kind of place where a family could drive up from Atlanta or Charlotte and feel they'd arrived somewhere. A real hotel in a real mountain village with real views of peaks that hadn't been logged to stumps. Andrew Huff's son, Jack, born in 1903, grew up in the hotel and caught his father's instinct but aimed it higher, literally. In 1926, Jack Huff hauled balsam logs to the top of Mount LeConte at 6,593 feet, the third highest peak in the Smokies, and built a tiny lodge accessible only by foot trail. The story goes that Jack once strapped his 90-pound semi-invalid mother into a chair, tied the chair to his back, and hiked 5 hours uphill so she could see a sunset from the summit. LeConte Lodge still operates today under National Park Service oversight, hosting up to 50 guests a night in rustic cabins with no electricity or running water. The Huff family's understanding of what Gatlinburg could be, a place where people paid not for luxury, but for proximity to something wild and ancient, was for decades exactly right. What made it right was a decision made far from Gatlinburg. In 1926, President Calvin Coolidge signed a bill authorizing the creation of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Unlike western parks carved from land the federal government already owned, the Smokies required buying out thousands of private landowners, small farmers, lumber companies, entire communities. It was the first national park where land costs were paid in part with federal funds. The process was brutal. Tennessee passed eminent domain laws in 1927, giving the Park Commission power to seize any property within the proposed boundaries. David Chapman, a Knoxville businessman, hosted lawmakers at the Elkmont Resort in 1925 to build support, and former Governor Ben Hooper got the job of buying the land. Nearly 6,000 people lost their homes. At Cataloochee, a preacher named Reverend Pat Davis told families gathered at Palmer's Chapel in 1928 that their valley fell inside park boundaries and they had to sell. Hattie Caldwell Davis later recalled women crying while men threatened to blow up roads and shoot anyone who tried to enter their valley. John Oliver, whose family had lived in Cades Cove since the 1820s, took his case to the Tennessee Supreme Court 3 times and lost every battle. Some families accepted lifetime leases, agreeing to sell their land at half price in exchange for the right to stay until they died, watching strangers hike trails that had been their footpaths to church. Others simply took what was offered and left. Whole communities with post offices, schools, and churches went dark. The Little River Lumber Company sold its timber rights and shut down by 1939, having harvested an astounding 560 million board feet of lumber over 3 decades. By the time the park was officially established in 1934, the Commission had assembled over 300,000 acres. President Franklin Roosevelt dedicated it at Newfound Gap in 1940. The park would eventually grow to 522,427 acres, over 800 square miles, straddling the Tennessee-North Carolina border, and it would carry one distinction that no other national park has matched. It charges no admission fee. Not then, not now, not ever. That detail, more than any other, would define Gatlinburg's future. Gatlinburg sat just outside the park boundary, and what happened next was staggering. In the park's first full year of operation, visitation hit 40,000. The second year, 500,000. The land beneath the Mountain View Hotel and the cabins along the parkway, land that had been worth $50 an acre in 1940, sold for $8,000 an acre by 1950. A town with no factory, no mine, no railroad, no port, a town whose only asset was a view, had just been handed the most visited piece of real estate in the entire national park system. And it hadn't had to do a thing except be in the right place. Gatlinburg incorporated in 1945. The same year, World War II ended, and American families started climbing into their new automobiles looking for somewhere to go. Many of the mountain families displaced by the park had moved into Gatlinburg itself, opening the small hotels, restaurants, and service businesses that the visitors required. The town was building an economy out of its own displacement, employing the people the park had uprooted to serve the tourists the park attracted. In the 1940s, the standard Gatlinburg hotel room included a fireplace and a private bath, all for $2 a person per night. The Skylift, Gatlinburg's first chairlift, opened in 1954 when the Maples family bolted it to the mountainside, carrying tourists above the tree canopy for a view that, at the time, included more forest than rooftop. In 1959, Jack Huff and his family came down from Mount LeConte and opened Jack Huff's Motor Lodge, which Jack's daughter Cookie and her husband Bruce still operate. The following year, a transplanted Hoosier named Jim Girding opened the Pancake Pantry, Tennessee's first pancake specialty restaurant, after falling in love with Gatlinburg during family vacations from Indiana. Girding had attended Indiana University, served 3 years in the military, married his wife June after a blind date in 1953, and vacationed in the Smokies the way Midwesterners did. Loaded the car, drove south, ate too much, went home happy. In 1965, Girding bought the land and building outright, a rare opportunity in a town where property was already being measured not in acres, but in frontage feet along the parkway. In 1969, Girding teamed with Dave Dyke Sr., owner of the old Smoky Candy Kitchen, to create the Village Shops, a cluster of European-inspired boutiques with brick pathways and lantern lights and gabled roof lines that looked like they'd been transplanted from Bavaria. That same year, the Gatlinburg Space Needle went up, 407 feet of steel topped with an observation deck offering a 360-degree view of the mountains and the town they were already beginning to swallow. From the top of the Space Needle in 1970, you could see the Mountain View Hotel, the Village Shops, the Pancake Pantry, the Skylift, a handful of motels and craft shops, and then the mountains, close, dominant, the reason for everything. Girding and Deitch had given the entrance to the Strip a coherent identity. Their buildings said something. This is a mountain village with taste, a place that takes its setting seriously. But even in 1970, the edges were fraying. The parkway was widening. New businesses didn't have the village's European restraint. Souvenir shops arrived, then T-shirt vendors, then candy-pulling machines visible through plate glass, then arcades, then wax museums, then mini golf courses, then go-kart tracks. Each one was individually harmless and collectively transformative. The strip that Jim Girding had tried to give a personality was, year by year, acquiring a different one. Meanwhile, 7 miles down the road, something was happening in Pigeon Forge that would change Gatlinburg's story permanently. Pigeon Forge had always been Gatlinburg's quieter neighbor. Smaller, flatter, a pass-through on US 441 for tourists heading into the mountains. In 1961, two brothers named Robbins opened a small attraction called Rebel Railroad, a coal-fired steam train that simulated a Confederate-era journey, complete with staged attacks. It was modest, a roadside curiosity, but the land it sat on would become the most consequential acreage in East Tennessee tourism. In 1970, Art Modell, yes, the owner of the Cleveland Browns, bought Rebel Railroad and renamed it Gold Rush Junction. In 1976, Modell sold to Pete and Jack Hershend, whose family entertainment company had been running Silver Dollar City in Branson, Missouri. The Hershends rechristened the Pigeon Forge Park Silver Dollar City, Tennessee, and began expanding. Then came Dolly. The story, as Ted Miller, the park's general manager, later told it, is that he turned on the television one evening and learned that Dolly Parton, born in a one-room cabin in nearby Pittman Center, raised in poverty so steep she later joked her family was dirt poor, but the good kind of dirt, was planning her own theme park somewhere in the Smokies. Miller realized the area couldn't support two competing parks. He suggested the Hershends fly out to meet Parton, who was on tour with Kenny Rogers in Denver. They reached an agreement, one that still holds. In 1986, the park reopened as Dollywood. First-year attendance, 1.3 million. The park has since more than doubled in size, invested over $110 million in expansions, and now draws more than 3 million visitors annually. TripAdvisor named it America's #1 theme park 3 times in 4 years. In 2025, Dollywood celebrated its 40th anniversary with the debut of the Dolly Parton Experience. In 2026, it's opening the Night Flight Expedition, a $50 million indoor coaster, the single largest attraction investment in the park's history. What Dollywood did to Pigeon Forge is obvious. It turned a pass-through town into a destination. Folks who remembered Pigeon Forge as a few souvenir stands on the road to Gatlinburg now barely recognized the place. What Dollywood did to Gatlinburg is subtler and more consequential. Gatlinburg had always defined itself as the gateway, the place you came to in order to reach the park. But Dollywood didn't need Gatlinburg, it was in Pigeon Forge. Suddenly, the traffic pattern shifted. Families arriving from the north could stop in Pigeon Forge, spend a day at Dollywood, eat at one of Pigeon Forge's proliferating dinner theaters and entertainment complexes, and drive into the national park from a different entrance without ever passing through Gatlinburg Strip. In 1982, Pigeon Forge had zoned its entire US 441 corridor for tourism development, a decision that essentially turned the town into a purpose-built amusement district stretching from Sevierville almost to Gatlinburg in a dazzling, relentless array of lights and signs. The result was visually alarming. Miles of neon, go-kart tracks, attractions like Wonderworks, the Titanic Museum, and Scooby-Doo miniature golf, but economically devastating for Gatlinburg's claim to be the indispensable stop. Pigeon Forge had figured out something that Gatlinburg, hemmed in by its narrow valley and its identity as a mountain village, had not. You don't need mountains to sell mountains. You need parking lots, flat land for building, and a theme park with a famous name. Gatlinburg responded the only way it knew how, by building more. Ober Gatlinburg, which had started as a ski resort in 1962, Tennessee's only ski resort, a distinction that says less about Gatlinburg's snow than about Tennessee's lack of it, added a Swiss-designed aerial tramway in 1973, took the Ober-Gatlinburg name in 1977, and kept expanding into alpine slides, ice skating, and mountain coasters. Ripley's Aquarium of the Smokies opened on the Parkway, housing over 10,000 aquatic animals in a building that has no more to do with the Smoky Mountains than a submarine has to do with the Sahara, but drew visitors by the hundreds of thousands. The strip that Jim Girding had envisioned as a European mountain village filled in with Guinness World Records museums, Hollywood wax figures, haunted houses, a Hollywood Star Cars museum, and Biblical Times dinner theater, where actors in biblical costumes staged sword fights while the audience ate. The Mountain View Hotel, Andrew Huff's original gesture of mountain hospitality, the building that had welcomed Eleanor Roosevelt and started the whole thing, was torn down in 1993 after standing for 77 years. What stands on that spot now is a parking lot. It belongs to Fun Mountain, an amusement complex. Guests park there to walk the strip, which is now so crowded on a summer Saturday that crossing the street requires waiting in a cluster of strangers for a walk signal, breathing second-hand smoke, while bumper-to-bumper traffic crawls past at speeds that would embarrass a glacier. The single road through downtown, the Parkway, was never designed for millions of cars. It was a mountain highway connecting a village to a park. Today, the gridlock is so severe that emergency response times have risen, and the city has struggled for decades to build infrastructure that keeps pace with visitor growth. Parking lots fill before noon. Side streets become improvised overflow. The Skylift Park, rebuilt as Sky Park, now featuring North America's longest pedestrian cable bridge, offers one creative response: take people above the traffic. But the fundamental problem is geometric. Gatlinburg is a narrow valley between steep ridges. There is no room for a second parkway, no space for a bypass that doesn't climb a mountain, no solution to the basic fact that 12 million people a year are trying to funnel through a town built for 600. Then, on November 23, 2016, the day before Thanksgiving, two juveniles playing with matches started a fire on the Chimney Tops Trail. The blaze began at about 5:30 in the evening in one of the most remote and inaccessible areas of the national park. Steep terrain with high cliffs and narrow rocky ridges that made direct firefighting virtually impossible. For 5 days, crews worked to establish containment lower down the mountain. Helicopters made bucket drops. The Gatlinburg fire chief said projections showed no immediate threat to the city. The fire was supposed to stay in the park. On Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, it mostly did. Then on Monday, November 28th, the drought that had been building all autumn, an extreme drought, the kind that turns a living forest into kindling, combined with winds that the National Weather Service would later clock at 87 miles per hour. Those are hurricane-force gusts. They sent burning embers sailing over ridge lines and into the city like incandescent confetti. The water-dropping helicopter was grounded. Power lines snapped and sparked new fires on streets that had nothing to do with the original blaze. Within hours, Gatlinburg was burning in dozens of places simultaneously. Officials reported more than a dozen structures on fire at once, including one of the city's largest hotels. The Chimney Tops 2 fire, as it came to be known, burned more than 17,000 acres, destroyed or damaged 2,460 structures, over 2,100 homes, nearly 60 businesses, and killed 14 people. 190 were injured. More than 14,000 residents and tourists were evacuated into a night-lit orange from every direction. The human cost was agonizing. Michael Reed lost his wife Constance and their 2 daughters, Chloe and Lily. His 911 call went dead after the dispatcher told Constance to stay on the line. Reed later filed a federal lawsuit against the National Park Service, alleging that employees failed to follow mandatory regulations to monitor and extinguish the fire before it left the park. His claim sought $250,000 in property damage, $150,000 for personal injury, and $13.5 million for the wrongful deaths. The lawsuit was one of many. Sevier County's mayor estimated damage at $500 million. Other assessments put the figure as high as $2 billion. The famous castle in Gatlinburg, gone. Most of the Westgate Resort and Spa, gone. The juveniles who started the fire were charged with aggravated arson, but Tennessee law at the time made it difficult to prosecute minors severely, and the charges were ultimately dropped when both turned 18. The community was left to rebuild without criminal accountability and, for many, without insurance settlements that covered actual losses. What Gatlinburg rebuilt in the months and years after the fire tells you what Gatlinburg had become. The old Mountain View Hotel, had it still existed, would have been in the fire's path. But the Mountain View was already a parking lot by then. What burned instead were the things that had replaced the old Gatlinburg: resort condos, vacation cabins, commercial attractions. And what went up in their place was more of the same, only larger. The Skylift was rebuilt as Sky Park, expanded with the Sky Bridge. Anakista, a mountaintop adventure park with zip lines, treehouse walkways, and a themed retail village called Firefly Village, opened in 2017, essentially on the ashes. In 2025, Anakista announced a $100 million 5-year expansion, the biggest growth phase in its history. The plan includes an all-glass gondola system, expanded canopy bridges, and a year-round artificial firefly experience to simulate the synchronized firefly displays that occur naturally in the Smokies every June. The real fireflies come free. The artificial ones cost the price of a park admission ticket. The cabin industry, which had been booming before the fire, exploded afterward. The broader Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge area now has roughly 17,000 short-term rental units, more than half of them cabins. In Gatlinburg proper, as of mid-2026, there are over 7,000 active short-term rental listings. The average nightly rate is $347. Average annual revenue per listing, around $46,000. The occupancy rate has been drifting down, 53% in the most recent data, and revenue is softening slightly. But the sheer density is what stuns. One analysis found that Gatlinburg has 1.73 active short-term rental listings per resident. Another found that Airbnb listings alone exceed the total number of residential homes, 107.7%. There are, mathematically speaking, more vacation rentals than places for people to live. The consequences are what you'd expect. Long-term rental inventory has cratered. Workers in the tourism industry, the cooks, the desk clerks, the ride operators, the people who actually make Gatlinburg function, struggle to find housing they can afford in the town that employs them. Property values have climbed to the point where families whose names have been in Sevier County since the Ogles and the McCarters are being priced out by investors from Nashville, Atlanta, and points north who view a Gatlinburg cabin the way a previous generation viewed a stock portfolio, as an asset to be managed for yield. The cabin isn't where you live, it's where your money sleeps. The town's defenders, and there are many, including tourism officials who point out, correctly, that the vacation cabin came before the Airbnb era, that Gatlinburg's identity was formed around tourism rather than disrupted by it, will note that tourism revenue funds local roads, pays for public services, and saves each household in the county over $11,000 a year in taxes. The only industry we have is tourism, the president of the Gatlinburg Convention and Visitors Bureau has said, and I think we do it very well. The numbers support that claim. But there's a difference between doing tourism well and having nothing left except tourism. Locals have been overheard on the town's trolley system telling tourists flatly that they'd be much better off once the visitors go home so they can get back to their lives. That kind of resentment used to be unthinkable in a town where hospitality was the family business, when the Huffs and the Ogles and the Girdings were the ones serving breakfast and carrying bags. Now the owners are in other states. The workers are commuting from 30 miles away because they can't afford to live where they work. And the guests are interacting with a workforce that has no particular attachment to the place. And yet, by every metric that matters to the people writing the checks, Gatlinburg is a triumph. Sevier County tourism generated $3.93 billion in visitor spending in 2024. That spending produced $251 million in state tax revenue and $187 million in local tax revenue. Without tourism, each household in Sevier County would pay over $11,000 more in taxes annually. Tourism supports more than 26,000 jobs. The park is free to enter, no admission fee ever, and it sits within a day's drive of roughly a third of the U.S. population. As an economic engine, there may be no more efficient arrangement in American tourism. A free attraction backed by federal land maintenance, surrounded by private sector lodging and entertainment that captures all the spending. The public pays to protect the park. The private sector harvests the visitors. Sevier County collects the taxes. Everyone wins, on paper. But step onto the parkway on a July Saturday and the paper dissolves. The road is a parking lot. The sidewalks are shoulder to shoulder. The shops are overwhelmingly interchangeable. Taffy, T-shirts, airbrushed souvenirs, knife stores, gun shops, the same mass-produced inventory you'd find in Myrtle Beach or Wisconsin Dells, or any other American tourist strip where the specific place has ceased to matter. The smell of kettle corn mixes with vehicle exhaust. Candy-pulling machines churn in shop windows. A Titanic replica sits downtown. You can visit a wax museum. You can buy a Confederate flag. You can eat pancakes at any of a dozen pancake houses, because the success of Girding's original pancake pantry spawned imitation after imitation until Gatlinburg became, improbably, the pancake capital of the South, a town where you can eat a short stack on every block, but can't find an affordable apartment if you're the person cooking them. The Smoky Arts and Crafts community, founded in 1937 along an 8-mile loop road outside town, still houses over 120 independent artisans, the largest such community in North America, and has been designated a Tennessee Heritage Arts and Crafts Trail. But the experience of reaching it requires first navigating traffic that moves at the speed of continental drift. The Pancake Pantry still draws a line out the door at 7 in the morning. Jim Girding, who died years ago, left behind not just the restaurant, but the signature building he designed in 1975, the one with the majestic slate roof and warm white oak interior. And it's still there, still serving 24 varieties of pancakes, still drawing people who come back year after year because it reminds them of a Gatlinburg that was coherent, that meant something. The village shops, Girding's other legacy, still stand, with their brick pathways and lanterns and fountain, surrounded now by a landscape that has no relationship to the one he and Dave Dyke envisioned. These are fossils of an older Gatlinburg embedded in the rock of a newer one, visible to anyone who looks, invisible to most of the 12 million who don't. From the top of the Space Needle, still there, still 407 feet, still offering that same 360-degree view, you can see the problem and the miracle simultaneously. To the south, the great Smoky Mountains, older than the Himalayas, still wearing their blue mist every morning, still free, still holding more species of trees than all of northern Europe combined. To the north and below, the Strip. Neon, traffic, the roof lines of Ripley's and the Wax Museum and the various attractions competing for the attention of people who drove hours to see mountains and are now standing in line to see a celebrity made of wax. The mountains haven't moved, but between them and the viewer, a town has interposed itself, a town that started as a gateway and became a bottleneck, that started as a craft village and became a carnival, that started with a 100-room hotel built by a man who believed people wanted to see something real, and now has 7,000 cabins operated by investors who may never have seen the Smokies themselves. The most visited national park in America drew about 12.2 million recreational visits in 2024, down from its pandemic peak of 14.1 million in 2021. The decline is slight, and the Smokies still outpace the second-place Grand Canyon by a staggering margin, roughly 8 million visitors. People will keep coming. The park is too beautiful, too accessible, too free to fail. The question is not whether the Smokies will survive. The question is what happens to the town that built its entire identity on being the door. Because the door is becoming optional. Pigeon Forge, with Dollywood and its expanding menu of attractions, the $50 million night flight expedition, the Jurassic Adventure dinosaur exhibit, Hulk Hogan's wrestling shop, Truth Traveler by the Ark Encounter, has its own highway corridor and its own gravitational pull. One study projected that Sevier County could see a 61% increase in employment over the next 25 years, and most of that growth is landing in Pigeon Forge, not Gatlinburg. Townsend, on the park's western flank, markets itself as the peaceful side of the Smokies, though it's rapidly discovering that advertising tranquility to the same population attracts the very crowds that destroy it. That town has fewer than 500 residents and is already seeing its two-lane roads overwhelmed by visitors fleeing Gatlinburg's congestion, bringing the same congestion with them. Cherokee, North Carolina, on the park's southern boundary, offers a different entrance entirely. The Oconaluftee entrance has seen visitation increase by 26% in recent years as tourists discover you can enter the most visited national park in America without ever seeing a wax museum. And the park itself, with 800 miles of trails and 380 miles of roads, is so vast that a visitor can spend a week inside it without ever passing through Gatlinburg. The town's monopoly on access was always partly illusion. There are multiple park entrances, but for decades Gatlinburg was the entrance, the one everyone knew, the one with the hotels and the restaurants and the craft shops. Now it's one of several, and not necessarily the most pleasant. There is a view from about halfway up the skylift, the old yellow chairlift that the Maples family first bolted to the mountainside in 1954, where you can see the whole valley at once. The river, the West Fork of the Little Pigeon, the same water that drew Martha Jane Ogle here in 1807. The parkway, the rooftops, the parking structures, the Sky Bridge, North America's longest pedestrian cable bridge, which didn't exist before the fire. The White Oak Flats Cemetery, tucked downtown, where the descendants of the founding families are buried within earshot of go-kart engines. And behind all of it, still, the ridgeline, older than the Himalayas, home to more species of trees than all of northern Europe, wearing its blue mist every morning like it has for 10,000 years. 70 years ago, a family riding that chairlift would have seen a mountain village, small, coherent, proud of its handmade quilts and its wild trout, and its hotel with private baths and carpeting, where you could get a room for $2 a night per person. That chairlift still runs. The view has changed, the ridgeline hasn't. On the site where Andrew Huff's Mountain View Hotel stood from 1916 to 1993, a family from out of state parks their SUV, locks it, and walks toward the Strip. They pass a fudge shop, a knife store, and a place that sells airbrushed license plates with your name on them. The mountains are behind them. They don't turn around.